change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So last week, we left Joshua and Israel defeated by the city of Ai because of the accursed things that were taken by Achan. But now the accursed things are removed from Israel. They're burned and they're buried in the valley of Achor along with Achan. And so the Lord, he isn't angry anymore. And so now it's time to move on. And so God's talking to Joshua and he's telling him not to be afraid. Because Joshua is afraid. Because Joshua, he can't handle the land of Canaan on his own without God. And so Joshua, he's not to be dismayed. He's to get over it. And it's like us, like after we've had a major defeat in our lives, and we're not sure if the Lord is willing to go with us anymore. But God, he reassures Joshua that he's with him. And now God's telling him to go to Ai. And he's telling him, see, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. And so this is now starting to sound a lot more like Jericho here, when God had given Jericho to Israel before Jericho was ever conquered. And so here again, Israel's success is assured. It's been promised, just like Jericho's success was also promised. And at this time, God tells Joshua that they get to keep all the spoils for themselves, along with all the cattle. So this time, the cattle's not to be killed, but to be divided up among them. And God, he's not even taking a cut of the spoils here. And so if Achan, if he could have only have waited and put off his covetous desires for just a couple days, then he would have saw God's generosity and he would have been able to have all the wealth that he wanted. Okay, so now this is God's plan. This is not just the best plan that man can come up with. And this plan, it looks nothing like their plan. Because last week, it looked like a spy movie with Joshua sending out spies and he listening to the advice of the spies and only sending 3,000 men. But in God's plan, this is more like a cowboy movie. This is like a Western because God says that they're going to lay out an ambush. And so instead of these 3,000 men, it's going to be 30,000 men for just the ambush part. So in God's plan, everybody's going. And they're not going to march up there this time during the day like they did before. This time, it's going to be a secret nighttime bushwhacking. And so all these 30,000 soldiers, they all set apart for the ambush that they made. And so they made this 15-mile march uphill at night, and they were to set themselves behind the city on the west side. And if Ai and Bethel are in the traditional locations where they're thought to have been, there is a ravine that's between them that's large enough to hide this many troops from either of these two cities. And so they're supposed to stay close to Ai, but not so close as to be seen. And then Joshua here, he goes and he spends his night with the rest of the people. So I believe that this is a way that Joshua was going to encourage the people that it's not going to be like the way it was before, that God is with them in this. And at this time, we won't be seeing any miracles like there were, like walls falling down like at Jericho. And so the next morning comes and Joshua, he's going to take now 5,000 men. And they're going to go up to Ai and they're going to do this. And they're going to go to the north side and they're going to hide over there. But they're going to approach, and I don't know what direction they approached the first time they went up. But now, instead of taking 3,000 men, he's taking 5,000 men. And he's putting them all between Ai and Bethel. So now these men, these 5,000, they're only about 2 miles away. And I have no idea what the king of Ai was thinking, but it says that he saw them coming early in the day. So this king, it doesn't seem to be much different than the first time that they came. Maybe it looks like they added maybe a couple more men, but it didn't seem to bother him. And so the men, they all start chanting this, beat them, bust them, that's our custom. And then they start chasing Israel down the hill again. And so this is to be like Beat Israel Part 2, the sequel. And the way I picture this is you see all these big burly men running down the hill, waving their arms like a bunch of little schoolgirls, and they're running away from Ai into the wilderness. And what God's doing here is that he's using Israel's prior failure, and now he's using it as his strategy for their success. God does this in our lives too, where he will take our defeats and our failures, and even when they've been caused by our own disobedience, and we can see him often use these things for our success. And it's often when we turn around that he will use those same things that brought these failures into our lives to bring about victory in our lives. Because our God, he is a God of second chances, and he doesn't waste anything that we go through, and he will even use our failures. And this time it says that every man, they left Ai. But this time we also see that every man also left the city of Bethel. So God is going to defeat both of these cities in this one battle. And so maybe that's why it was going to take so many men. But when the trap was set, the Lord tells Joshua to turn around. And so Joshua, he turns around and he holds his spear up. So it's kind of like Moses when he's holding up his staff and holding up his rod. But this is a lot scarier because this is a spear. And now there's no one left in the city. So there's no one that can keep these 30,000 men from going into the city of Ai. And then they burn it down. And so now the men of Ai and the men of Bethel, they're caught between these two armies with nowhere to run. And all the people of Ai are killed, and we're told it's 12,000 people, all except for the king of Ai, where he was brought to Joshua to be killed later and then hung on a tree until nighttime. And even though that sounds barbaric, what we need to see here is that this king, he has already killed 36 men of Israel, and he would have loved to have killed every last one of them if he had his way. So this man was Israel's enemy, and he had never sought peace. So the king of Ai, he really isn't a victim here. And then they pile a heap of rocks on top of the king's body, as they did with Achan, to make it kind of a memorial and as a warning that this land is Israel's. And the name Ai, it doesn't stand for artificial intelligence. It actually means ruins. And then it uses this word heap here, which is actually the Hebrew word for tel, which means a mound. And that's the word that they use for where an ancient city used to be. Like you've heard of the name like a Tel Aviv. Well, that means that used to be an ancient city, and the way they found it is because all these ancient cities, when they're buried, they create a mound where they've been buried. And so now you have the defeat of Ai and Bethel, and Joshua, he now leads the people 25 miles away to Mount Ebal. And now Ebal, it's in the area north of Shechem, which is this plains between these two mountains, between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And this is the same place where Abraham first built his altar when he came to Canaan. And this is also the place where Jacob dwelt for years, where you'll find Jacob's well is located. And this later became known as the city of Samaria. And so this is pretty much in the center of Israel. And if you're going to just look at this in the natural sense, this doesn't seem to be a very strategical or logical thing to do. Because now they're going to stop here. And they've already just had 2 successful battles, and they've only had a minor setback. But instead of going and conquering the rest of Canaan, Joshua's going to stop here. And he's going to build an altar to the Lord on Mount Ebal. And this is all out of obedience. because these are instructions that were commanded to Israel by Moses. And they're all written down, and you can read all of these instructions in the book of Deuteronomy in chapters 27 and 28, where they were to go to these specific mountains and to build an altar for sacrifice and to read the law. And when I read this, I always keep in mind that Moses, he commanded this. And if you remember, Moses had never been to Shechem. Moses had never been to Mount Ebal or Mount Gerizim his whole life. So this really is a plan from God. And now what they're doing is they're going to perform what they were ordered to do. They're going to build a natural altar on Mount Ebal with natural stones. So it's nothing fancy. There's no carvings. And the rocks are not even to be cut on the top to make a flat surface. There's supposed to be nothing of man here because there is nothing that man can add to make this more holy. In fact, man's work would only defile it. So the first thing they do is they offer the burnt offerings. And a burnt offering is when the whole animal is burnt up. And this represents their whole lives being fully offered to God in consecration. And then they offer the peace offerings. And peace offerings can only come after a burnt offering. So after your life is consecrated to God, you can have peace with God. And a peace offering is a fellowship offering where you're going to have fellowship with God. So this is like sitting down with God and having a meal with God, where God, he gets his part of the offering, and then the priest, he gets his part of the offering, and then you get a part of the offering. So you get a meal as the worshiper. And so this is like having a family barbecue with God, where you're all getting to eat with God at his presence. And then after this, in the ancient days, conquering kings, what they would often do is they would write out their victories on plastered stones. And they would build these monuments, and they would leave them of these conquering battles that they had performed. But here, Joshua, he doesn't write down his victories. But what he does is he writes out the complete book of Deuteronomy, the book of the law, and he writes them on these plastered stones. And he writes that whole book down in one day. And then Joshua, he reads the whole book of the law to Israel. And so they stand there all day listening to it. And then when it's finished, the people of Israel, they're divided into two parts with 6 tribes each. And 6 of them are to stand in front of Mount Ebal, the mountain of curses. And what they're going to do is these tribes are going to all shout amen in agreeing to what will happen to Israel if they don't obey the law. And then these 6 tribes that are here in front of the Mount of Cursing, Mount Ebal, they're all the tribes that came from Jacob's wives, Zilpah and Bilhah. So these were the servant girl wives, and they became Jacob's concubines. But because these wives had only produced 4 sons, and so only 4 tribes came from them, 2 tribes had to be added to be even 6 tribes and 6 tribes. And so Reuben was added, and they say that Reuben was added because he lost his right as the firstborn because of his sin against his father Jacob. And then Zebulun, he was also added, but they don't really give a reason for it. I think it's because maybe it was alphabetical. It started with Z, but I'm really not sure that applies to Hebrew, but in English that works. And then they're all standing in front of Mount Gerizim. So you have 6 tribes from Jacob's legitimate wives, the wives that Jacob loved and married, Leah and Rachel. And they're all there in front of the mountain of blessings. And now you have Joshua, he's standing with the Levites, and when all the blessings were read and all the curses read, the groups would shout amen after each blessing and after each curse. And so what this is this new generation of Israel, and they're now renewing the covenant, but this time they're renewing the covenant in the land as it was commanded. So now it's not their parents' covenant, but now it's their own. And here, it wasn't just the people of Israel, but it says it was also the strangers living among them. So that would have included Rahab and her family. And then you'd have the Kenites who came from Midian. They were Moses' brother-in-law's family. And then you have all this mixed multitude among them that had come from Egypt. Okay, so now we get to chapter 9. And now Joshua and Israel, they're back again. They're fully committed to God again. But meanwhile, somewhere in Canaan, there's something evil happening, and there's this meeting going on. And it's all these evil kings that are located on the west side of the Jordan River. And so this kind of reminds me of like the show Batman, where you have all these evil villains and they're meeting and they're going to be making these plans against Batman. So it's like you got the Hivites, you got the Amorites, you got the Canaanites, you have the Pezerites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And so it's all of them from the hills and all of them from the coast, all the way up to the northern border at Lebanon. And they've been hearing all this news, and they know what's happened to Jericho and to Ai, and they've decided not to wait around until Joshua comes to their town, because now it's not time to be defensive anymore. It's time to be offensive. And so it's time for them now to make alliances. So this is now like that TV show Survivor. And so all these rival kings from all these rival nations who have never gotten along with each other, who have constantly been at war with each other, are now making alliances with each other because now they have a common enemy to unite them. Because they realize that they can't defeat Batman on their own or Israel. And instead of Israel having to go to each city to fight, they're going to bring the fight to Israel. So they're planning a frontal attack. They're planning a head-on-head battle. And so now these battles are going to be fought in the open fields of battle instead of these individual cities. But not everybody thought this way in Gotham or Canaan, because there is this group of Hivites called Gibeonites. And that's because they were Hivites from the city of Gibeon. In fact, they were made up of 4 small cities. And these people, they see no hope in joining the alliance. They don't think that's their best chance in joining this confederation of evil forces against Israel. And to them, that still sounds like a losing proposition. And they've also heard about this defeat of Jericho and Ai. And those cities, they're not very far from them. And Gibeon is probably the next city on the list because Israel's getting very close to their territory because they're only located about 25 miles away. But Israel doesn't know who they are yet. And so they're going to have to do something quick, and time's not on their side. And you kind of wonder here if maybe they've been spying on Israel, that maybe they had somebody listening when Joshua was reading the law out loud at Ebal, because they know that Israel has been commanded to destroy all the inhabitants of Canaan, just like it says in Deuteronomy chapter 7 that Joshua had just read there. And they would also have known from Deuteronomy that they were allowed to make alliances and treaties with the people who dwelt outside of the land of Canaan. So maybe there was somebody from Gibeon listening when Joshua read chapter 20, and where in verse 10 it says, "When you go near a city to fight against it, then proclaim an offer of peace to it. And it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open up to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under tribute to you and serve you." And by the Gibeonites already knowing that Israel was not willing to make a treaty or to coexist because of where they lived, they didn't even try to be honest with Joshua because they didn't believe that would work. So they felt that they had the need to deceive Joshua, and maybe somehow they could be left to be allowed to live, because they know if they offered an honest treaty, it would be rejected outright. And so here you could think that Israel's greatest enemy isn't really this confederation of kings who are going to come to attack them head on, but it could be this nation who's going to try to deceive them by trickery. And it says that the Gibeonites were crafty. And that doesn't mean that they were building little bird houses or scrapbooking. What it means is that they were creating this great deception. They were going to put on this great play for Israel. And so they're going to have to get all their costumes just right and to get all their actors all dressed up as ambassadors, and that they're coming away from this far away country, from a place that you never heard of before, because this is a land far, far away. And so this is almost like a fairy tale, because this is a fairy tale, because this is all make-believe. And then they dug through their garbage and they took the old bread that they were probably going to feed to their pigs. And then they put it in their old sacks and they put their wine into their old, most torn and mended wineskins. And then they wear all their old patched up garments and their worn out sandals. And then they loaded up their donkeys. And then they drove them over there and they started looking like the Beverly Hillbillies coming down through the hills of Gilgal. Now, this is a different Gilgal than the Gilgal that they stayed at when they first crossed the Jordan. And the very first thing that we hear out of the Gibeonites' mouths from our reading is where they just come out and say, make a covenant with us. And they tell Joshua their lie, because we're from a very, very far away place. And Israel here, they knew that they were Hivites. And it may be because the language that they spoke, or maybe it was because of their accent. But they did have some discernment here, because this didn't sit right with them. And so they call it out right away. And it almost came out as if they were accusing them of lying. And they say, how do we know you don't live among us? How can we make a covenant with you? And so they ask all the right questions, and they never thought to pray about it. And we're told in verse 15 that they never did ask counsel of the Lord, because I believe if they would have asked him, he would have given it. And the Gibeonites here, they didn't address any of the questions that Israel asked them when they asked about where they're from. They just said, we're your servants, which is very humble. And Israel, they're not used to people treating them like this, because so far, every foreign people that have come across Israel, they've cursed them and they've been hostile to them and they've tried to fight them. So this is very different. This is different because these people seem to like them, but it still doesn't sit right with Joshua, because he asks them straight up. He says, who are you? Where do you come from? So now this is twice now, because there is this sense that the Lord gives to his people. He gives them this discernment about when they're being lied to. And this discernment, I believe, God gives to all of us, and it comes from God when somebody's trying to con you. But you can override this discernment, and you can ignore it. And these people are good liars. And these people, they wrote a really good play and they put it on. They could have all won Academy Awards. And then what they do to convince them is they use a little God talk, some religious words as if they're God seekers, that we came from a far country because we heard of your God's fame and we came to worship him. And now they're confessing this belief in their God. In all good cons, they usually have a God bless you with it, a little God talk.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,